You step onto a cobbled street in ancient Rome. The sun beats down, illuminating grand temples and the ceaseless bustle of the Forum. Voices chatter in Latin all around you, the air thick with the smell of baking bread and something less pleasant from a nearby drain. This is the heart of a colossal empire, a place striving for order amidst its vibrant chaos. But what happens when that order cracks? When a theft shatters the peace, or a quarrel escalates into violence? Who protects the citizens and punishes the guilty in this sprawling metropolis? Join us as we journey into the intricate, often unforgiving world of Roman crime. We will explore how this ancient civilization enforced its laws, conducted its trials, and meted out its unique forms of justice. You have considered the Roman approach to justice, to the enforcement of laws, to the trials and punishments. But before we can understand how justice was applied, we must first define what exactly counted as a crime in this ancient world. What actions were deemed so disruptive, so offensive to the social fabric, that they demanded the state's intervention? The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was an ideal, a period of relative stability and order across the vast empire. Yet, even under the watchful eye of emperors and the intricate web of Roman law, human nature remained. Conflict, greed, jealousy, and ambition all conspired to shatter that peace, both in grand political schemes and in the everyday lives of ordinary citizens. A crime, in essence, was an act that broke this delicate balance, challenging not just an individual victim, but the authority of the law and the stability of society itself. The Roman legal system, complex and evolving, broadly categorized offenses into two areas: public law and private law. Imagine yourself observing a dispute in the Forum. Matters of private law, known as delicta, involved wrongs against an individual or their property, typically resolved through civil action where the victim sought compensation. Think of it as one citizen suing another, rather than the state prosecuting. Conversely, crimina, public crimes, were offenses against the state, against the entire Roman people, demanding public prosecution and punishment. While the distinction could blur, grasping these foundational categories is crucial to understanding Roman justice. Consider a common scenario: theft. You walk through the bustling market, your purse securely fastened. Suddenly, a nimble hand reaches out and your coin purse vanishes. This act, furtum, was a widespread concern. As a delict, a private wrong, you, the victim, would initiate legal proceedings. You would accuse the thief before a magistrate, aiming to recover your stolen property and perhaps receive a penalty payment, often double or quadruple the value. Severity depended greatly on circumstances. Was the theft open or sneaky, by day or night, and was the thief caught in the act? The law distinguished between a manifest thief, caught red-handed, who faced much harsher penalties, sometimes even being beaten or handed over as a slave if the theft occurred at night with violence, and a non-manifest thief. But what if theft was accompanied by violence? What if you were mugged in a dark alley, your belongings forcibly taken? This was rapina, robbery. While still bearing elements of private wrong, the use of force elevated it towards a public crime, often resulting in heavier fines, sometimes 4 times the value of stolen goods, and potentially public disgrace or exile for the perpetrator, especially if of lower status. The Roman legal system, unlike many modern systems, was heavily influenced by the social standing of both victim and accused. A wealthy citizen might access more legal recourse and face a different outcome than a poor freedman accused of the same offense. Beyond property, crimes against persons were equally pressing. Assault, known as injuria, literally unjust act, encompassed offenses from verbal insult and defamation to physical battery. Imagine someone striking you in the street. This was initially a delict. You, the wronged individual, would bring the complaint, seeking monetary compensation. A judge would determine the sum based on the insult or injury's nature and, crucially, the social status of both parties. A blow to a Roman senator carried a far higher penalty than one to a slave or common plebeian. The law sought to restore the injured party's honor. Murder, however, was unequivocally a public crime, a crimen, known as parricidium, though initially referring to the murder of a parent or close relative. Later, it expanded to encompass any intentional homicide. Taking a Roman citizen's life fundamentally destabilized the Pax Romana and offended the gods. You would not personally sue a murderer. Instead, the state, through magistrates or later standing criminal courts, would prosecute. Penalties for murder were severe: exile, property confiscation, or even execution. Decapitation for Roman citizens, or more brutal methods for non-citizens, such as crucifixion or being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. Adultery, a concept that evolved significantly, also held a unique position. For much of the Republic, it was a private matter, an offense against the husband who held considerable power over his household. He might even lawfully kill an adulterer caught in the act within his home. However, under Emperor Augustus, adultery was elevated to a public crime, specifically for women. The Julian law on the repression of adultery made it a matter for state prosecution, carrying penalties of exile and loss of property for the offending woman and her paramour. For men, rules differed. Adultery with a married woman was a crime, but not with an unmarried woman, a widow, or a prostitute. This stark contrast highlights the deeply ingrained patriarchal nature of Roman society and its laws. Beyond these immediate personal and property offenses, Rome also contended with crimes against the state itself. Treason, per duellio, was among the gravest. Conspiring against the emperor, inciting rebellion, or betraying the Roman people could lead to death. Imagine the fear of being accused of such a crime, where your loyalty to Rome was questioned. Similarly, forgery, sacrilege, and fraud were serious threats to Roman commerce and religion, punishable by severe fines, public flogging, or forced labor. Falsifying wills, for example, could dismantle entire family inheritances, striking at the heart of Roman property and lineage. The very concept of culpability, of guilt, rested heavily on intent. Did the accused act with dolus, malicious intent, knowingly and willingly committing the offense? Or was it culpa, negligence, or carelessness, where harm was caused but not intentionally sought? The law recognized these distinctions. An accidental death, while tragic, would be treated differently from a premeditated murder. The Roman legal mind sought to discern the perpetrator's purpose, even if psychological evaluation tools were far from what we have today. So, as you navigate the bustling streets of ancient Rome, remember that every interaction, every transaction, every spoken word, was framed by an intricate web of laws defining right and wrong. Breaking the Pax Romana, whether through a petty theft in the market or a grand act of treason against the emperor, invoked a system designed to restore order, punish the guilty, and reinforce the values of a civilization that prided itself on its legal foundations. Consequences for those who transgressed varied wildly, not just by their offense's nature, but by their standing in the rigid hierarchy of Roman society. Understanding this complex definition of crime is the essential first step in comprehending the unique forms of justice that awaited those who dared to break the peace. Understanding this definition of crime is crucial, but knowing what happened when a crime occurred demands that you look beyond the legal texts themselves and into the very streets of ancient Rome. Who, you might ask, was responsible for upholding this intricate web of laws? Who would you call if your purse was snatched, or if a brawl erupted outside your insula? The answer is not as simple as dialing a 3-digit number. There was no single, unified police force as we understand it today. Instead, Rome relied on a mosaic of institutions, each with distinct roles, powers, and limitations. Imagine you are standing on a bustling street in the Subura district, just as dusk begins to settle over the city. The air grows cooler, the shadows lengthen, and the sounds of the day slowly give way to the murmurs and rustles of the Roman night. This is when the city's first line of defense against both fire and petty crime would begin their rounds. The vigiles. Conceived by the Emperor Augustus in the early 1st century CE, the vigiles urbani, or city watchmen, were a truly innovative creation. You might think of them primarily as firefighters, and that was indeed their most crucial role. Rome, with its tightly packed wooden buildings, narrow alleyways and countless oil lamps and open hearths, was a constant tinderbox. A single spark could devour an entire district. The vigiles, organized into 7 cohorts of about 1,000 men each, were stationed in watch houses known as excubatoria across the 14 Augustan regions of the city. If you were a Roman citizen, you would know exactly which cohort was responsible for your area. But their duties extended beyond just fire suppression. As the night deepened, the vigiles became Rome's night watchmen. You might hear their heavy sandals on the cobblestones as they patrolled, carrying lanterns to illuminate the dark, winding streets. They were on the lookout not only for signs of smoke but also for any suspicious activity. A shadowy figure lurking in an alleyway, the telltale creak of a door being pried open, the muffled cry for help, these were the things that would draw the vigiles' attention. Their authority, however, was somewhat limited. They were primarily concerned with minor offenses, particularly theft committed under the cover of darkness. If you were caught picking pockets or attempting to break into a shop at night, it would likely be the vigiles who apprehended you. They had the power to make arrests and could even administer a summary beating for minor infractions, a common form of immediate street justice in the ancient world. They would then deliver the accused to a higher authority like a magistrate in the morning. Yet, despite their importance, the vigiles were not a fearsome police force. Many were freedmen, not full citizens, and their pay was not particularly generous. Their equipment was practical for firefighting: buckets, axes, hooks to pull down burning structures, but less intimidating for serious crime fighting. They rarely carried swords, relying instead on staves or clubs. They were the reassuring presence in the dark, the first responders to your cries of fire or thief. But they were not the ultimate enforcers of Roman order. For more serious disturbances, for crimes that threatened the Pax Romana with a heavier hand, Rome relied on a different, more militarized force: the urban cohorts. Picture yourself now in the bustling Forum Romanum during the bright light of day. The crowds are thick, merchants hawk their wares, and politicians deliver speeches from the rostra. Here, you are much more likely to encounter the imposing figures of the cohorts urbani. Also established by Augustus, the urban cohorts consisted of 3 cohorts, each numbering up to 1,000 men. These were not freedmen. They were Roman citizens, often drawn from Italy, and they were far better equipped and trained than the vigiles. The urban cohorts were essentially a paramilitary police force for the city of Rome. Their primary mission was to maintain public order during daylight hours, preventing riots, dispersing unruly crowds, and apprehending more serious criminals. When you saw an urban cohort on patrol, you would immediately recognize them by their more martial appearance. They wore armor, carried shields, and were armed with swords and spears, much like regular legionaries. Their presence was meant to be a visible deterrent, a clear message that the state would not tolerate widespread disorder. If a major disturbance broke out, a large street brawl, a protest that turned violent, or even a public execution, it would be the urban cohorts who would move in to restore order. They operated under the direct command of the urban prefect, one of the most powerful officials in Rome, second only to the emperor himself within the city. This gave them considerable authority, much more so than the vigiles. They could make arrests, detain suspects, and were capable of using significant force to quell any uprising. You might wonder how these two forces, the vigiles and the urban cohorts, interacted. There was a clear division of labor, though sometimes their roles might overlap. The vigiles handled the night and minor offenses, especially fire. The urban cohorts handled the day and more serious threats to public order. If the vigiles apprehended a dangerous criminal at night, they would hand him over to the urban cohorts or a magistrate in the morning. They were two distinct layers of Rome's unique law enforcement system. And then there was another, even more formidable force, though not typically involved in everyday law enforcement: the Praetorian Guard. While their main duty was to protect the emperor and his family, and to serve as a strategic reserve for the army, the Praetorians were a powerful presence within the city. You would recognize them by their distinctive uniforms, often more elaborate than standard legionaries. Their barracks, the Castra Praetoria, were just outside the city walls. While they did not patrol the streets looking for pickpockets, their involvement in an arrest or an investigation would signify an offense of the highest gravity, often treason or a matter of imperial security. Their shadow loomed large, a reminder of the ultimate power behind Roman law. So, how did these forces truly enforce the law? What was the sword in practice? When an urban cohort apprehended a suspect, the process was often swift and direct. There was no complex forensic investigation as we know it. Evidence might be a stolen item found on the suspect, eyewitness accounts, or the simple fact of being caught in the act. The suspect would be taken into custody, often to a local lockup or directly to a magistrate. Physical force was an integral part of apprehension. Resisting arrest, even if you were innocent, could lead to a beating. In a society where public corporal punishment was common, the idea of gentle restraint was not widely held. The purpose was clear: subdue the suspect and bring them to justice. For many crimes, particularly those involving public order or direct threats to the state, the authorities had significant power. However, it is crucial to remember that for a vast number of offenses, particularly those against private citizens like theft or assault that did not escalate into a public disturbance, the Roman legal system still relied heavily on private prosecution. This meant that if your property was stolen during the day and the urban cohorts were not directly present or involved, it was often your responsibility to identify the perpetrator, gather evidence, and bring a private lawsuit against them. The state provided the courts and the judges, but often not the investigators. This system presented both strengths and weaknesses. It decentralized a lot of the enforcement, pushing some of the burden onto citizens themselves, especially those with resources. If you were wealthy, you could hire agents, even bodyguards, to protect your property and track down offenders. If you were poor, you had far fewer avenues for redress. This inherent inequality was a persistent feature of Roman justice, influencing every step from apprehension to sentencing. You might walk past a small shrine dedicated to a local deity, noticing an offering left for protection. This reflects a deeper truth. In ancient Rome, even with the vigiles and urban cohorts patrolling, a sense of personal vulnerability lingered. The city was vast, the forces of order relatively small for its population. Corruption too was a constant shadow. A well-placed bribe could turn a blind eye or secure a release, particularly if you held a position of influence. Yet, despite these challenges, the presence of the vigiles and urban cohorts did provide a framework for order. Their patrols, their visible presence, and their swift action in cases of riot or fire were fundamental to the functioning of Rome, ensuring that the grand machinery of Roman law had hands and feet to enforce its decrees. Their sword, though not always visible, was always understood as the ultimate arbiter of the state's power. It was a constant reminder that while the law defined crime, these specialized forces were the instruments that would ultimately bring you face to face with its consequences. You stand amidst the bustling heart of Rome, the Forum Romanum. The roar of the crowd, the cries of vendors, the murmur of countless conversations, it all washes over you like a warm tide. But today, a different kind of intensity hums in the air. The consequences you have heard about are not just whispers in the shadows. They are here, laid bare under the fierce Roman sun. This is where the instruments of the state's power, those vigiles and urban cohorts, deliver you or your accuser into the very crucible of Roman justice. You push your way through the throng, past the Vestal Virgin's house, the imposing Basilica Julia, and the Rostra, where politicians once delivered their stirring speeches. Today, those same platforms and basilicas transform into bustling courtrooms. Roman justice, particularly for serious crimes, was a profoundly public spectacle. There is no quiet, sequestered chamber here. Every word, Every accusation, every impassioned plea echoes across these hallowed grounds, witnessed by an eager and opinionated public. Imagine for a moment that you are accused, perhaps of theft, a common crime in this sprawling metropolis, or even something far graver like murder or treason. Unlike modern systems, there was often no dedicated public prosecutor in the early republic or even much of the empire for many offenses. Instead, it was up to a private citizen to bring an accusation. You or someone else would step forward, publicly declaring the alleged crime and formally initiating the process. This system, while placing a heavy burden on individuals, also served as a deterrent, as any citizen could become an accuser, driven by a sense of duty, a desire for vengeance, or sometimes, less nobly, by personal gain or political maneuvering. Once an accusation was accepted, a preliminary investigation might take place, but the real battle was fought not with evidence in the scientific sense, but with words. This is where Roman society truly shone, or perhaps, revealed its most dramatic flaws. Oratory was not merely a skill, it was an art form, a weapon, and often the sole determinant of your fate. You would hire or enlist the help of a patron or a professional orator, a master of rhetoric whose voice could sway an entire assembly. Watch as a speaker takes the stand, his toga meticulously draped, his gestures precise and emphatic. He uses every trick in the oratorical book, pathos appealing to emotions, ethos establishing his own or his client's credibility, and logos using what logic he could muster. The crowd, the very jurors, are his audience. He knows their biases, their prejudices, their love for a good story. He will paint vivid pictures of innocence betrayed or villainy unmasked. He might even bring the accused family into the forum, their tearful presence a silent, powerful plea. The courts themselves varied. For serious public crimes, you might face a jury assembled from different social classes, often hundreds strong, sitting in one of the permanent questions perpetui, or standing commissions. These commissions dealt with specific types of crimes: extortion, bribery, electoral fraud, murder. Other cases, especially those involving disputes over property or inheritance, might go before the centumviri, a court of 100 men. The precise number could fluctuate, but the principle remained: a large body of judges making decisions based on argument and reputation. The actual presentation of a case was a theatrical event. You hear the orator for the prosecution begin, his voice rising and falling, his words sharp as daggers. He attacks not only the alleged crime but often the very character of the accused. He might dredge up past indiscretions, question their lineage, or cast aspersions on their friendships. There were no strict rules of evidence as you might understand them today. Hearsay was common. Character assassination was a legitimate strategy. The goal was to discredit the opposing party entirely, to make them seem unworthy of belief, regardless of the specific facts of the case. Then comes the defense. Your orator, perhaps a towering figure like Cicero, steps forward. He might acknowledge certain facts but reframe them. He might attack the accuser's motives, suggesting they are driven by envy or political ambition. He will praise your virtues, recount your services to the state, and emphasize your good standing in the community. Witnesses might be called, but their testimony was often less about concrete facts and more about character endorsement or denouncement. A witness could testify to your good name, or to the accuser's bad one. It was a contest of narratives, a battle of reputations fought with words. Consider the role of the patron. If you were a man of means or had powerful connections, your patron would be your legal advocate, your champion in the court of public opinion. His influence, his network of friends, his very presence, could weigh heavily in your favor. For those without such connections, justice could be a far more perilous path, leaving them vulnerable to the eloquence of a skilled but unscrupulous opponent. This underscores a fundamental truth. Roman justice, for all its grand pronouncements, was deeply intertwined with social status and personal influence. What constituted evidence? It was largely testimonial. Slaves, under torture, could provide testimony, though its reliability was often debated. Written documents were presented, but their authenticity could be challenged. There was little to no forensic science. Instead, the weight of a case rested on the credibility of the accusers and the accused, the skill of their orators, and the collective judgment of the jurors, swayed by emotion, logic, and often the prevailing political winds. After hours, sometimes days, of impassioned speeches, rebuttals, and counter-rebuttals, the moment of truth arrives. The jurors, whether a select panel or hundreds of citizens, cast their votes. They might use wax tablets marked with A for absolvo, I acquit, or C for condemno, I condemn, or an L for non liquet, it is not clear, a hung verdict. The outcome is announced and the forum holds its breath. A cheer might erupt, or a collective sigh of disappointment. Your fate has been decided. The punishments for crimes in ancient Rome were varied and often severe, reflecting the hierarchical nature of their society. If you were found guilty, your social standing would largely determine your sentence. For citizens of good repute, fines, exile, or the temporary loss of civil rights might be imposed. Exile, to a Roman, was often a fate worse than death, separating them from their homeland, their family, and their dignitas. However, for crimes of a more serious nature, or for those of lower social status, the punishments escalated dramatically. Corporal punishment, such as flogging, was common. For grave offenses like treason or patricide, capital punishment awaited. This could involve crucifixion, beheading, or being sewn into a sack with animals and thrown into the Tiber. The gruesome details served as public deterrents, grim reminders of the state's ultimate power. For slaves, the consequences were always more brutal. They had virtually no legal rights, and their owners could inflict severe punishment, even death, with little recourse. While we often think of public criminal trials, much of Roman law also dealt with private disputes, similar to civil cases today. Theft, assault, or damage to property could lead to legal action brought by the wronged individual, seeking compensation or restitution rather than outright punishment from the state. However, the line between private and public was often blurred, with both types of cases sometimes heard in the same bustling forum, contributing to the vibrant, chaotic scene. The entire process was, at its core, a form of public theater. It was designed not only to deliver justice, but to reinforce the values of Roman society, to demonstrate the power of the law, and to serve as a cautionary tale. The dramatic confrontations between accusers and defenders, the impassioned speeches, the sheer uncertainty of the outcome, it all contributed to a spectacle that drew crowds and became a part of the daily rhythm of Roman life. You witness it all, the raw emotion, the calculated strategy, the hopes and fears played out on a grand public stage. You might pause before the Basilica Julia, its massive arches still echoing with the ghosts of ancient arguments. The scales of justice, often depicted as a symbol of fairness, were in reality frequently tipped by wealth, influence, and the sheer power of spoken word. Bribery was a persistent problem, an open secret that could undermine even the most eloquent defense or the most damning accusation. A well-placed sum could ensure a favorable verdict or at least a less severe punishment. The ideal of impartial justice was always there, an aspiration. Yet the human element, with all its flaws and ambitions, often steered its course. This system, for all its imperfections, was the bedrock of Roman legal thought, shaping not only the lives of its citizens but influencing legal traditions for centuries to come. It was a world where justice was loud, public, and often brutally effective, a world where your standing in society, your connections, and your ability to articulate your case or have it articulated for you, were as crucial as any objective truth. It was a system that understood the power of persuasion, the weight of reputation, and the enduring human desire for both order and spectacle. The Forum, then, was more than just a marketplace or a political center. It was the pulsing heart of Roman law, a place where destinies were decided, reputations forged or shattered, and the very fabric of society was both tested and reinforced through the power of argument and the weight of tradition. You leave the Forum, the din of its ancient courts still ringing in your ears, carrying with you a profound understanding of how Rome brought its citizens face to face with the full force of its justice. You have grappled with the intricacies of Roman law, witnessed the legal theater unfold in the Forum, and understood how Rome confronted its citizens with the full force of its justice. Now you must confront the grim reality of that force. For the Roman state, a verdict was merely the beginning, a gateway to a vast, often brutal, array of punishments designed not just to exact retribution, but to terrorize, to deter, and to powerfully assert the absolute authority of empire. Rome's system of penalties was a carefully calibrated instrument, a stark hierarchy where your social standing determined not just your fate, but the very manner of your suffering. Imagine yourself in the heart of the city, the shouts and clamor of daily life muted by a growing sense of dread. Your eyes are drawn upwards towards the sheer, unforgiving drop of the Tarpeian Rock, a natural precipice overlooking the Forum. This was a site reserved for crimes of the gravest magnitude: treason against the state, the sacrilege of parricide, the murder of a father. You stand among the hushed onlookers as a condemned figure, bound and helpless, is led to the edge. The air hangs heavy with anticipation. There is no trial here, no last appeal, only the brutal physics of a final plunge. A collective gasp escapes the crowd as the deed is done, a chilling reminder that some transgressions could only be purged by utter obliteration. The Tarpeian Rock was an ancient, immutable symbol of Rome's zero tolerance for those who threatened its very foundations. But the Tarpeian Rock was just one dramatic stroke in Rome's broad palette of retribution. The most infamous, the one that still sends shivers down the spine, was crucifixion. You would have seen it, perhaps along the roads leading into and out of Rome, a stark, agonizing silhouette against the sky. This was not a punishment for Roman citizens. For them, death was typically quicker, more honorable. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, for rebels, for pirates, for the lowest classes, for those Rome deemed utterly disposable. It was a slow, public agony designed to break not just the body but the spirit, to dehumanize utterly. The condemned would be nailed or tied to a large wooden cross, left exposed to the elements, to hunger, to thirst, to the jeers and stares of passers-by, often for days. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a fresh wave of unimaginable pain. The stench of sweat, blood, and decaying flesh would hang in the air, a constant reminder of imperial power. You would avert your gaze, perhaps, but the image would be seared into your memory, a terrifying lesson in absolute obedience. Consider the crime of parricide, the killing of one's own father, an act so abhorrent to Roman sensibilities that it demanded a punishment utterly unique in its savagery, the pena culiae, or the punishment of the sack. You would witness the condemned, scourged until blood ran freely, then sewn into a leather sack. Not alone, however. With them, confined in that suffocating enclosure, would be a rooster, a dog, a viper, and a monkey, living creatures meant to torment and symbolize the unnaturalness of the crime. The sack would then be thrown into the nearest river or sea. You would hear the terrified squawks, the barks, the desperate thrashing from within before the cold water swallowed it whole. It was a drowning, yes, but a drowning accompanied by the terror of being torn apart by desperate animals, a symbolic return to the chaos of nature for one who had violated the most sacred bond of family. For Roman citizens, even when facing capital punishment, there was a measure of distinction. Decapitation by sword, swift and comparatively clean, was typically the preferred method. You would not suffer the prolonged agony of the cross, nor the ignominy of the sack. The sword offered a degree of dignity, a recognition of your status even in death, a stark contrast to the drawn-out torment reserved for others. And then there were the arena punishments, spectacles designed to entertain as much as to punish. Imagine yourself amidst the roar of the Colosseum or a local amphitheater. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was a gruesome fate, often meted out to criminals of the lowest order, runaway slaves, or notoriously early Christians. You would watch as figures, stripped and unarmed, were thrust into the arena to face hungry lions, bears, or other wild animals. The crowd's cheers and bloodlust would be deafening, a visceral celebration of power and order being violently reasserted. The sand of the arena would quickly darken with blood, a chilling testament to Rome's ruthless efficiency. Burning alive, often for arsonists or those deemed enemies of the state, was another horrific spectacle reserved for the arena, a public immolation meant to purify by fire and to instill utter terror. But not all punishments were capital. For many, the severing of ties, the loss of standing, or a life of grueling labor awaited. Exile, for example, came in different forms. Deportatio was a severe form, often permanent, involving the loss of citizenship, property, and banishment to a remote island or distant province. You would be stripped of everything that defined you as a Roman, cut off from your community, your family, your very identity. Relegatio was a milder form, a temporary banishment without the loss of property or citizenship, a stern warning rather than a complete erasure. For others, the punishment was a living death, forced labor. You might find yourself condemned to the mines, toiling in the dark, suffocating tunnels, digging for the resources that fueled the empire. The air would be thick with dust, the clang of picks echoing endlessly, the overseer's whip a constant threat. Life in the Roman mines was short, brutal, and utterly devoid of hope. Or perhaps you would be condemned to the quarries, chiseling stone under the relentless sun, shaping the very empire that had condemned you. This was a form of penal servitude, stripping you of your freedom and reducing your existence to pure, unremitting toil. Flogging and scourging were common punishments for a wide range of offenses, especially for humiliors, the lower classes. You would see men and women publicly stripped and whipped, their backs lacerated, their cries echoing through the streets. This was not merely about pain, it was about public humiliation, a stark demonstration of authority, a warning to others. The sting of the whip, the burning shame, the collective gaze of the crowd, these were designed to break both body and spirit. Slavery itself could be a punishment, a descent into bondage for debt or specific crimes, though more often it was a condition of birth or capture in war. You could be sold into servitude, losing all rights, becoming the property of another, your life dictated by the whims of a master. The very essence of your being, your freedom, your humanity, would be utterly stripped away. Financial penalties were also common, often coupled with other punishments. Fines could be exorbitant, property confiscated, stripping you of your wealth and your means of subsistence. For the wealthy, this could be a severe blow, though perhaps preferable to physical punishment. For the poor, it could mean utter ruin, destitution. And then there was infamia, a powerful social sanction. While not a physical punishment, its effects could be devastating. Infamia meant the loss of your reputation, your civil rights, your ability to testify in court, to hold public office, or even to vote. You would become a social outcast, a pariah, living in the very heart of Roman society yet utterly excluded from its privileges and protections. The weight of public disapproval, the ostracization by your peers, could be a living hell, a social death as crushing as any physical torment. Through this vast and varied system of penalties, Rome sought to achieve several critical objectives. Deterrence was paramount. The public nature of many punishments, from the Tarpeian rock to the crucified figures on the roadside, was a deliberate theatrical display, a vivid warning to anyone contemplating defiance. Spectacle was entwined with justice, ensuring that the consequences of crime were etched into the collective consciousness of the populace. Retribution was also key, a sense of balance restored, the wronged avenged, and the social order reaffirmed. But above all, these punishments served to maintain the rigid social hierarchy of Rome. The contrast between the swift, comparatively honorable death of a citizen by decapitation and the prolonged, agonizing torment of a slave or non-citizen on the cross spoke volumes about who held power, who truly mattered, and whose life was deemed expendable. You witness a system that understood the power of fear, the importance of order, and the unwavering conviction that the authority of Rome, once challenged, must be reasserted with an iron fist, for all to see, for all to remember. You walk away from these grim scenes, the images burned into your mind, the sounds of suffering still echoing in your ears. You have seen the full spectrum of Roman justice, from the reasoned arguments of the Forum to the brutal finality of punishment. This was a society that built monuments to law, but also erected crosses and sharpened axes. It was a world where order was absolute, and the cost of challenging it breathtakingly high. And through it all, you understand the deep, primal fear that underpinned the glittering facade of Rome, a fear that was as carefully constructed and as enduring as its aqueducts and its roads. You have seen the public displays, the pronouncements, the brutal finality of Roman justice. But what became of those who fell afoul of Rome's carefully constructed order before their final judgment was delivered? Where did that fear coalesce into physical confinement, into a waiting room for the condemned? You turn your gaze now to the shadowed, less celebrated corners of the city, to the places where the accused awaited their fate. Roman prisons were not what you might imagine from modern understanding. They were rarely places of long-term punishment in themselves. Rather, they served as temporary holding cells, secure spaces where individuals were kept before trial, during trial, or while awaiting the execution of a sentence, be it exile, corporal punishment, or death. True imprisonment as a sentence for years on end was uncommon in the Roman legal system, reserved mostly for the very highest treason or certain exceptional circumstances, especially in the later empire. For the most part, a Roman prison was a place of anxious anticipation, a dark threshold to an unknown future. You approach the Carcer Tullianum, Rome's most famous and infamous state prison, located at the base of the Capitoline Hill, near the Forum. It is an ancient place, its history stretching back to the earliest days of the city, attributed in part to the legendary kings Ancus Marcius and Servius Tullius. From the outside, it appears as a sturdy, unyielding structure of massive stone blocks, a deliberate statement of impermeability. Its entrance, humble and forbidding, suggests a space designed to take in, but rarely to let out in freedom. You step inside, or rather, you are led down. The initial chamber, the carcer proper, is a cramped, dimly lit space, cut into the solid rock. The air immediately feels heavier, cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth, unwashed bodies and human fear. There are no windows, only a flickering oil lamp or torch providing a meager illumination that makes the shadows dance and deepen. Here, men and women of all social strata, accused of various crimes, might be held together. You hear the low murmurs of voices, the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet, and the rhythmic drip of water seeping through the stone. The atmosphere is one of profound uncertainty, of waiting. But it is the lower chamber, the Tullianum, that holds the true horror, a place etched into the collective Roman memory as a pit of no return. You imagine the experience. A narrow opening in the floor of the upper carcer leads down into this sub-level dungeon. You are not walked downstairs. You are lowered, or perhaps forced to climb down a ladder, or even pushed into the darkness below. The Tullianum is a small, circular chamber, entirely subterranean, fashioned from volcanic rock. It is utterly devoid of natural light. Imagine yourself in that space. It is cold, always cold, the air stagnant and heavy. Water constantly seeps through the stone walls, creating a perpetually wet and chilling environment. The floor is likely often a mire of mud, filth, and human waste. There is no furniture, no comfort, nothing but the bare, cold stone and the company of despair. This was the final resting place for many of Rome's most notorious enemies, those condemned to a brutal end. Jugurtha, the rebellious Numidian king, met his death here, left to starve and freeze. The Catilinarian conspirators, those who plotted against the Republic alongside Catiline, were strangled in this very cell under Cicero's consulship. The very name Tullianum became synonymous with a death sentence, a place where a man entered but never truly left alive. The acoustic qualities of such a space would be haunting. Every sound would be amplified and distorted by the stone. The clanging of a jailer's keys, the splash of water, the low moans of the suffering, the desperate prayers, or the raw curses of the condemned would echo, creating a symphony of misery. The sensory deprivation, combined with the extreme physical discomfort, would be a torture in itself. You would feel the immense weight of the earth above you, the crushing finality of your situation. While the carcertullianum was the most famous, it was by no means the only form of detention. Rome's legal system made use of other holding facilities. Wealthy citizens accused of crimes might be placed under house arrest, confined to their own homes or the homes of a patron, a more lenient form of pretrial detention that recognized their social status. For slaves, the situation was far grimmer. Many wealthy estates maintained their own private prisons, known as ergastula, where rebellious or unproductive slaves were chained and forced to work. These were places of brutal exploitation, often deep underground, far from the public eye. Military prisons also existed, designed to hold soldiers who had committed offenses, or enemy combatants captured in war. You might find temporary holding cells in the basements of some public buildings, or even in private residences of magistrates who needed to detain an individual quickly. But these were generally short-term solutions. The fundamental purpose remained the same: to secure an individual. There was little thought given to rehabilitation or reform, concepts alien to Roman penal philosophy. If you were accused, you were detained to ensure your appearance in court. If you were convicted, you were detained until your punishment could be carried out. The time spent in confinement was not the punishment itself, but merely a precursor to it. The daily conditions inside these places of confinement were dire. Food and water were not consistently provided by the state. Prisoners often relied on family, friends, or even charitable citizens to bring them sustenance. Imagine the desperation of someone without connections, slowly starving in the dark. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, leading to rampant disease. Vermin would infest the cells. The cold, the hunger, the constant threat of illness, and the psychological torment of uncertainty would gnaw at the spirit. You realize that even within these grim walls, social hierarchies persisted. A high-ranking Roman might have some privileges, perhaps a slightly cleaner space, or more reliable provisions from their family. A commoner, or worse, a slave, would face the harshest realities, abandoned to the mercy of the jailers and the elements. These custodes, the guards, held significant power over their charges, and instances of corruption, brutality, and neglect were undoubtedly common. So, as you step back from the cold, damp stone of the carcertullianum, you carry with you a different understanding of Roman justice. It was not just about the law courts and the public executions. It was also about the silent, suffocating dread of the waiting rooms of death, the forgotten pits of confinement. It was a system that, while valuing order and the swift administration of consequence, also understood the potent power of holding someone utterly helpless, stripped of dignity, and facing an inevitable, often brutal, end. These were the places where fear was not just a concept, but a palpable, crushing reality, enduring as the very stone that held its victims captive. You emerge from the chilling depths of the carcertullianum, the echoes of its silent dread still clinging to you. That fear, that absolute powerlessness, was indeed a universal constant within Rome's grim carceral system. Yet, the path that led you to such a place, the trials you endured, and the ultimate fate awaiting you, would be profoundly different depending entirely on who you were in Roman society. Justice in this grand empire was not a blind goddess. She wore an aristocratic sneer, or perhaps a sympathetic glance, always keenly aware of your status. Imagine yourself accused of a crime. For the vast majority of Rome's inhabitants, the humiliors, the humble ones, the lower classes, this accusation alone could be a death sentence, or at least the beginning of an inescapable descent. If you were one of the humiliors, perhaps a freedman struggling to make ends meet, or a farmer from the rural hinterlands, you would find yourself quickly apprehended by the city's vigiles or lictors. There would be no polite summons to court, no leisurely consultation with legal experts from the comfort of your home. Instead, you would be seized, perhaps in the bustling forum, or dragged from your meager dwelling, and immediately thrown into a public prison. Your detention, even before trial, was designed to be punitive. You would share cramped, unsanitary cells with petty criminals, debtors, and those deemed enemies of the state. Food would be scarce, water often foul, and the air thick with disease and desperation. Access to family or legal advice would be minimal, if not entirely denied. You would stand accused, almost certainly without bail, your fate already tipping precariously against you. Now shift your perspective. Imagine you are one of the anesturiors, an honorable citizen. Perhaps a senator, an equestrian, or a wealthy merchant with generations of Roman ancestry. If you were accused of the very same crime, your experience would be radically different. Your accuser might first have to bring a formal charge, often through a lengthy and complex legal process, rather than a simple arrest. Even if arrested, you would likely be placed under house arrest, confined to your lavish villa, surrounded by your slaves and your books, rather than being dragged through the streets to a public jail. Your friends, your clients, your influential connections would instantly be mobilized on your behalf. You would have immediate access to the finest legal minds in Rome, orator lawyers who could sway juries with rhetoric and legal precedent. Bail, if necessary, would be arranged swiftly, your considerable property serving as surety. The entire process, from accusation to trial, would afford you every possible advantage. Your testimony as an honestur would carry immense weight. The testimony of a humilior, however, might be dismissed out of hand, or worse, extracted through torture if they were a slave or even a lower-class free person in certain circumstances. The law itself, though ostensibly applying to all free Romans, possessed a cruel flexibility that bent heavily in favor of the elite. Sentencing was where this disparity became most glaringly apparent. For the anesturiors, corporal punishment was almost unheard of. To physically assault a senator or an equestrian, even by judicial decree, was an affront to their dignity, their very status. Their bodies were considered sacrosanct, representing the dignity of the Roman state itself. If you, an honestur, were found guilty of a serious crime, you might face a hefty fine, a confiscation of property, or perhaps exile. Exile, while a severe disruption, often meant living comfortably in another Roman province or allied city, retaining much of your wealth and social standing. Death, if imposed, would likely be a swift and relatively dignified decapitation by sword, a soldier's death, considered a privilege compared to the agonizing methods reserved for the lower classes. You would not be publicly flogged, you would not be branded, and your body would not be left to rot as a public spectacle. But if you were a humilior, your sentence for the very same offense could be unimaginably brutal. Theft, assault, even minor insubordination could result in you being scourged, your back flayed open by the lash in the public forum, a searing humiliation that would leave you scarred for life, if you survived. For more serious crimes, you might be condemned to the mines, a living death sentence of back-breaking labor under the scorching sun, perpetually starved and beaten, until your body gave out. Or perhaps you would face the spectacle of the arena, forced to fight wild beasts or other condemned men, your death providing entertainment for the masses. The ultimate punishment for the humiliors was often crucifixion, an excruciatingly slow and public execution designed not just to kill, but to utterly dehumanize and terrorize. Imagine yourself nailed to a rough wooden cross, left to hang for days, exposed to the elements, to hunger, thirst, and the taunts of passers-by, your body a gruesome monument to Roman power and its unforgiving justice. Or perhaps you would be burned alive, a horrifying end designed to purify the community of your perceived wickedness. These punishments were not just about retribution. They were vivid, agonizing warnings to everyone who witnessed them, a brutal demonstration of what awaited those who dared to defy the established order and lacked the protection of status. And then there was the lowest tier of all, the enslaved. Roman law did not consider slaves as persons with rights but as property. If you were a slave, your life was entirely at the mercy of your master. An accusation of any crime, however minor, could lead to immediate, arbitrary, and often fatal punishment from your owner, with little to no legal recourse. If a slave committed a crime against a free person or the state, the consequences were even more dire. Under interrogation, slaves were routinely tortured to extract testimony, a practice considered invalid for free citizens unless under extreme circumstances, and almost never for honestiores. Their testimony was only considered credible if given under duress. If a master was murdered, all slaves in the household, regardless of their individual culpability or even presence at the time, could be executed. This was a deterrent of ultimate brutality, designed to ensure absolute loyalty and to warn against any thought of rebellion. Imagine the constant visceral fear of living as a slave, knowing that your life could be forfeit not just for your own actions, but for the actions of another or simply at the whim of your owner. Your body was not your own. It was an instrument for labor and a canvas for pain if punishment was deemed necessary. This stark division in legal treatment reflected the core values of Roman society. The honestiores were the pillars of the state, their dignitas and gravitas essential for maintaining social order and political stability. To humiliate them publicly or inflict corporal punishment upon them was to undermine the very fabric of Rome. The humiliores and slaves, however, were seen as requiring constant control, their potential for unrest a perpetual concern for the ruling elite. Their bodies were expendable, their suffering a useful tool for maintaining discipline and deterring crime among the vast, restive population. Even the process of appealing a verdict, a right often associated with Roman law, was largely inaccessible to the lower classes. While a wealthy Roman might navigate the complex avenues of appeal, securing support from patrons or powerful friends, a humilior would find such doors firmly shut. They lacked the financial resources, the social connections, and often the understanding of the intricate legal system to mount a successful appeal. Their fate, once sealed by a magistrate, was generally irreversible. So, when you consider justice in ancient Rome, you must set aside any modern notions of equality before the law. You must recognize that the scales of justice were not balanced. They were heavily weighted by lineage, wealth, and social standing. The powerful could bend the law, avoid its harshest consequences, and often escape with little more than a bruised reputation. The weak, the poor, the enslaved, faced a system that was designed to crush them, to extract their labor, and to make their suffering a public spectacle of control. It was a system that openly declared its bias, operating on the principle that some lives were simply worth more than others, and some bodies were meant for punishment while others were meant for protection. The question, justice for every Roman, receives its answer not in grand legal pronouncements, but in the chilling disparity of the punishments meted out. It is in the clean, swift death of the nobleman versus the agonizing, drawn-out torment of the commoner, or the slave's anonymous end in the mines or on the cross. It is a stark reminder that even in a civilization renowned for its laws, the ultimate measure of your rights often came down to your place in society's rigid hierarchy. Your very humanity, in the eyes of Roman law, was quantifiable, and it dictated your destiny. You stand now in the heart of Rome, the clamor of the forums swirling around you. Imagine this place not merely as a marketplace, but as the pulsating center of an empire's legal consciousness. For centuries, etched onto 12 bronze tablets, stood the very bedrock of Roman law, a foundational text that defined what it meant to be Roman, what you could own, what you could do, and what you could suffer. These were the laws of the 12 tables. Before their creation, around 450 before Common Era, the law had been largely unwritten, a mysterious body of custom and precedent held by the patrician elite. Justice was often a whispered interpretation, dispensed by aristocratic magistrates. For the common people, the plebeians, this meant the law was a tool easily bent by those in power. Accusations could materialize from nowhere, judgments delivered without clear basis. The plebeians demanded a written code, clear public laws everyone could know. A commission of 10 men, the decemviri, drafted this seminal document, reportedly studying Athenian laws before compiling a uniquely Roman code. When these 12 bronze tablets were finally unveiled in the Forum, it was a revolutionary moment. For the first time, the law was literally laid bare. No longer could it be selectively applied or twisted without public scrutiny. Anyone who could read or have the text read to them possessed an understanding of their rights and responsibilities. This was the dawn of a legal tradition that would define an empire and influence the world for millennia. But as you lean closer, examining the imagined inscriptions, you realize that while they brought transparency, they did not necessarily bring equality. The 12 tables codified many existing social distinctions, cementing the hierarchy that governed Roman life. They were a snapshot of early Roman society, a reflection of its values, its fears, and its priorities, and within them, you find the stark principles that determined your fate. Consider the very first table, dealing with the summons to court. Someone called you, you had to go. If you hesitated, the accuser could call witnesses. If you still refused, they could physically drag you there. If you tried to evade justice, the accuser could seize you. This was a system where the wronged party had considerable power to initiate proceedings, often with force. It was a rough and ready justice, where the initial burden of enforcement fell squarely on the individual. Move to the third table and you encounter the harsh reality of debt. If you borrowed money and failed to repay it, the law was unforgiving. After a set period, the creditor could take you, bind you with chains. If your debt remained unsettled, the law allowed for a chilling consequence. The creditor could sell you across the Tiber as a slave, or even, in the most extreme interpretation, cut you into pieces. This provision speaks volumes about the Roman attitude towards economic obligation. Your economic standing directly dictated your freedom, your body, your very existence. The fifth table touches upon family law, specifically the power of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. His authority, known as patria potestas, was immense. He held the power of life and death over his children, could sell them into slavery 3 times, and managed all family property. This was the absolute bedrock of Roman social order. Crimes within the family unit, or those against the paterfamilias, were treated with unique severity. This table laid bare the fundamental unit of Roman society and its absolute governing authority. Let us turn to the 8th table, which addresses delicts or private wrongs encompassing theft and injury. For minor injuries, the law prescribed specific monetary compensations. For example, if you broke a free man's bone, the compensation was 300 asses. For a slave, it was 150. This illustrates how even in the face of physical harm, the value of a person's body was literally quantified and differentiated based on their social status. For more serious injuries, particularly permanent disfigurement, the principle of talio, an eye for an eye, was still permitted. If you inflicted such a wound and could not reach a settlement, the law permitted the injured party to inflict the same injury upon you. However, this harsh retaliation was often mitigated by monetary compensation, suggesting a gradual move from direct physical vengeance towards fines and restitution. This table shows the slow evolution of Roman law, still socially stratified but seeking structure. Theft, or furtum, was another significant concern. If you were caught in the act of manifest theft at night, the 12 tables permitted the victim to kill you without being liable for homicide. If by day, you could be killed only if you defended yourself with a weapon. Otherwise, you would be flogged and assigned as a slave to the victim. For non-manifest theft, the punishment was typically a fine of double the value of the stolen goods. These distinctions highlight the Roman emphasis on property protection and the right to defend one's possessions, even with lethal force. The act of being caught in the act carried a far heavier penalty, reflecting a society that valued swift, visible justice for overt transgressions. Other tables addressed public crimes such as treason or bribery, prescribing the ultimate penalty. If you incited an enemy against Rome, or delivered a Roman citizen to an enemy, you faced death. These were crimes against the very fabric of the state, and its response was absolute. Building laws were present, addressing issues like trees overhanging a neighbor's property. Even religious matters like disturbing funeral rites were within their purview, reflecting the deep integration of religion into Roman public life. The 12 tables were more than just rules, they were a cultural blueprint. They established core principles: the importance of formal procedure, the rights of citizens, the sanctity of property, and the clear delineation of social standing. They were not perfect, archaic, sometimes brutal, and certainly biased. But they formed the essential scaffolding upon which later Roman legal geniuses, the praetors and jurists, would build. Their long shadow is seen not just in specific provisions, but in the fundamental mindset they instilled. They taught Romans to think legally, to categorize, to define, and to argue based on written statutes. They laid the groundwork for the incredibly sophisticated legal system that Rome would develop, renowned for its clarity, its logical structure, and its ability to adapt and expand across a vast empire. From these initial, stark declarations, Rome would eventually develop concepts like equity, good faith, and a more nuanced understanding of intent. But the seed was planted here in the bronze tablets of the Forum. You cannot fully grasp how Rome dealt with crime, how it built its immense legal framework, without first understanding these 12 foundational texts. They are the initial, unequivocal statement of a society grappling with order, responsibility, and the very definition of justice, a definition that, from its inception, was deeply intertwined with who you were and where you stood in the grand Roman hierarchy. Their legacy reminds us that even advanced legal systems begin with blunt instruments, slowly honed and refined over centuries, yet forever bearing the marks of their earliest, most fundamental principles. The shadow they cast was indeed long, shaping not only Rome but the very idea of law itself.